Right. That's a lovely aquarium you're sitting in, Chris. Just watch out for that puffer fish. They're poisonous. Right. Okay, I'll share my screen a bit as well. Okie dokie. Cool. All right. So we have. Sorry, I always forget to link this guy. And the homepage still doesn't appear as a homepage. But I'm not sure why, even though it's set as homepage. Let me just check if this is actually linked. Cool. Okay, so class recordings go here. I do have the recordings for last week, but I just need to chop off the briefing portion because I think that's the only part that will actually matter. And then you have it if you want to review it, or if you missed it, should be able to upload it today. Like I said, we did fall behind with some of the feedback. It's still, an awful lot of work to go through. So, 30 odd students, or close to 30 students, and each one of you have about 2 to 3 shots that we have to review 100 frames or so. So it does add up. It takes a while. So that's why I'd like to try and do as much of it in class so that you can also carry on, what to carry on with for that, for the remainder of the week. Then, so we're doing progress reviews and then we're syncing on that. We can have another discussion about the specialization within the group. Not everyone's animating. As I mentioned before, in the brief, it doesn't stipulate that you have to absolutely animate in this term. You've already been assessed on your animation skills. But it obviously plays a big role in the final picture and the final film, an impression of the final film. So you're getting evaluated on the overall quality of the animation, but not necessarily your individual contribution to the animation. Obviously, again, if you're building a portfolio, you need to and you want to animate, or you want to get a position as an animator, then you need to focus on the animation. You need to do as much of that as possible and as well as possible. So it doesn't mean that you're not reaping the benefits of all the hard work. It just means that you're not explicitly getting marked on animation. Okay. So we're going to look at some optimization tricks, and then I'll explain what I mean by preliminary comp tests, what you need for next week's hand-in. We can have a look at what we've, the feedback that we've given on the past shots, and just quickly recap, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. You can still go back and refine those shots, but don't fall too far behind and carry on with the shots that we're reviewing for next week as well. Try and stay up to date as much as you can. Communicate with your team. Try and still have weekly meetings. I know this subject probably demands a lot more of your time than anything else. It is unfortunately the nature of the medium. It's not something that you can design one evening, print the next. It takes a long time. It takes a lot of work, dedication. I think you reap the benefits in the end if you can see people enjoy your film. That's very rewarding. But also just finishing something as massive as a film will give you a great deal of job satisfaction. You'll definitely feel a lot better about yourself having completed something that seemed like such an or unachievable task, and then hopefully you'll look for the next project to get involved in because you want that kick all the time. Right, that's how they get you. First one's free. Okay, so please post updates as often as you can. We'll look at those sync sketch links. So the animatic serves as our point of departure, but if you have any new stuff for us to look at, I'd also like to expand on the production schedule that we've drafted to indicate what passes each shot needs or is rendering, or what things we have available there. what extra things we might need in that shot, like the VFX and so on, so that we just have something to always reference and make sure everyone's sort of doing their bit. And yeah, reach out and let us know if you need any help at any point in time. Tasks and deadlines. So next week is your pre-comp hand-in. I made it for the Wednesday so that like the Tuesday and Thursday classes don't really have any particular advantage. And it's not that much of an ask really, because it's almost better for you to get it wrong now, or if something is wrong, it's something that we can identify and then fix. Or if, I mean, wrong in the sense would only be wrong in the sense if there's information missing. So it'll only be partially wrong. At least you'll still render something, but some of the passes we might need to add a few, or some passes might be unnecessary, and then you can just remove them. Essentially, you're preparing your renders for compositing. Like I said, we are going to look at a little bit of optimization, but mainly it's what sort of file format to use and how to set up that particular format to extract the information that you need from it. Passes could include anything from, well, it would include your color pass, most likely, cryptomats, depth pass. Sometimes you want to separate your shadows. Sometimes you need additional reflections if you want to comp things back into glass surfaces or something like that. Last year we had a tricky one. We had one of the characters was a fish, and then we have not only the character that needs to be lit, but we have the refraction, the water, the refraction of the glass, the reflection of the water, reflection of the glass, and all of those elements to sort of try and manage, and that becomes difficult. Like whenever you have stuff like that, that's tricky. They always say, if you want to show off your VFX skills, then have a wet dog running through the rain. That's kind of like the the culmination of everything. It's like fur and moisture and droplets and whatever. So I think just plan well and try and take shortcuts or figure out, problem solve those specific problem areas. Okay. They're also referred to as money shots in films, because they take the most time and effort to do, and most likely involve the most artists, so they're expensive to make. I think it was the Making of the Incredibles, where they spoke about all the sort of effect shots and things that they had planned for the film, and that they had like a short list of those and only effects on that, and then the one VFX supervisor goes on a rant and says, and there's an explosion, and there's an explosion, and there's hair, and there's wet hair, and there's blowing hair, floating hair, running, whatever, hair on fire, stretchy hair, everything. So yeah, it's awful if these problems, so to speak, just keep on creeping up. It's better to plan for them. Okay, so that's the assignment. We'll go through the compositing process today, so hopefully that'll make more sense. What you need to hand in then is your video presentation, so your render pass broken up into the different, or rather your render sequence or shots or portions of your shots. Hopefully they'll like whole shot, but doesn't have to be rendered in detail. Just the passes need to be set up, and we want to see that those passes actually exist. So two things that we need from you. The one is a sort of your typical VFX composite render. So you'll show us the color pass, and then you'll mask out the color and show us whatever other passes you have. Likely, again, like I said, your depth pass, perhaps your ambient occlusion pass could be separate, your cryptomats and that sort of stuff. So if you can just see what you have. Again, this really shouldn't be all your passes. If you're rendering a multi-layered EXR, they get really big if you add everything, so don't do that. And then a single frame from each one of the sequences that you're going to be doing, so that we can also just have a look and see if those passes are in fact in there, or if there's something that you didn't showcase, that we can just have a look and see if it's actually there. Okay, so that's just sort of like a backup. It also informs us on the actual planning behind the shot, so that we can see, what are you separating? What are you planning on separating? What are you planning on putting everywhere? The presentation itself, all the passes, it's more about the understanding of how those passes work. So that doesn't need to happen for every shot, but we do need a single frame from every shot. Okay, so the first one is just to show that you understand passes. The second shot is the second portion where you supply us with the single EXR frames is where we identify the passes per shot. Okay, I'm just jumping back, see if I've missed anything in the conversation. Professional practice thing. Oh, it's on campus. Okay. Okay. It should be fine, I think. I don't think it'll be a massive problem. Well, yeah, no, it's fine if you're here. We'll just look at your shots. Cool. All right. My dog is, I don't know if you can hear. It's upset with the people outside. Okay. Cool. Let's head back to today's breakdown. Under additional resources, there's a SyncSketch interview with Glenn Keane. For those of you that don't know Glenn Keane, he did Dear Basketball, that won an Oscar. I think I might have a playlist here somewhere with his stuff on it. You can also watch the Um, there are tools in animation that do that. I'm going a little bit on a tangent here, but what it essentially means is that there are things that you can do in animation to make your job easier, so that you don't have to do the frame by frame kind of approach to everything. Um, and then there are also global truths. So there are things that you can do in one software application and translate that information or that process of generating that content to another workflow. So you can easily switch from something like animation to game if you're familiar enough with the sort of terminology, the workflows, the underpinning knowledge there. So why I feel like this is important is that if you understand the underpinning um, construction, the method for the constructing of those elements, then it's very easy for you to switch from one application to the next, which is ultimately what we want from third years, is to be software agnostic and to be able to do whatever you do in 3D and apply that to any medium or output. And even if someone asked you to do the same 3D task but in a different 3D application, you should technically still be able to translate that information that you've acquired in Blender. The reason why you don't want to get stuck on a on a software application is, well, I can think of two. The one is the developers are most likely teams of people working on workflows and tools, and your workflow might not stay the same or be able to stay the same. Like software can get canceled or it can evolve into something else. Your workflow would change. They could introduce bugs. You can't get set on your particular tool. You have to be able to evolve and adapt. Just a minute. The second thing is, before my train of thought was interrupted by the fighter jet. About the understanding of the process. It's valuable that you can switch from one thing to the next. It's important that you're able to do the same thing across different fields. And if that particular task is then automated or taken over or made easier or simplified by the software development trajectory, you need to be able to adapt. Maybe that's not something that you need to necessarily do anymore. It's happened with like the entire texture workflow has changed fairly recently. Like PBR workflow is probably like 5 years in practice. It might be an older concept, but it's only been adopted recently, and now that's the way that we do things. And the same thing will be true for animation with the introduction of motion capture technology, or rendering with the introduction of real-time render engines. But there's still underpinning information that you need. Even though the process might change, the building blocks remain the same. And that's really been true because I've come from all sorts of different software applications, practice animation in all sorts of fields. And I still, if I need to do something in a particular software application and I haven't worked in that pipeline or process or that aspect of 3D animation in a while, I'll still go back and reference something on YouTube because, it's right there at your fingertips. It's the same thing with, remembering phone numbers. It's something that we used to do because we didn't have mobile phones, and no one carried a little phone book with them. So we had to memorize phone numbers. How many of you, or how many phone numbers have you memorized since you have access to a mobile phone? Do you know any off heart? That's the kind of thing that happens. Technology has advanced to a point where it's no longer necessary for us to store all that information at hand because we have a mobile phone. Now, it is good to keep some in mind and have some memorized, in case of emergency and so on. So it is good to know where things come from. But in essence, all you need to know is what the building blocks are and what to go and look for if you're adopting new software. So last year I did this thing. This is what it's coming down to. Last year I did this thing where I tried to show how to comp the exact same sequence in Blender, After Effects, and in Fusion. And because I'm only sort of touching on there's only enough time to touch on the very essence of what happens in that compositing process that I found that it's quite redundant because you're getting really basic skills on all of those. And if you are actually already choosing which one to composite in, you probably know those basic skills already. So I thought I'd dial it back a bit. And I included some videos here that cover basic principles like Cryptomats, working with EXRs, working with lookup tables in software to get the EXRs to display properly in that compositing software, and then how to approach things like depth of field and comp that in additional software applications. Okay, so that's essentially what's happening over here. Now, these were fairly sort of surface level YouTube searches, got the results that I wanted. There's definite value in what they're doing and how they're approaching it, but it doesn't mean that that is necessarily the exact approach that you need to take. Find whatever you need from, the online resources that you have, because like I said, there's a wealth of it and it's stupid to ignore, but don't try and discern between what is valuable to you, what fits with your process and workflow, rather than just directly copying whatever they're doing. So this first dude covers Cryptomats and the way that Blender 3 does it. That's the value in it. What he does afterwards is he saves up PNG sequences of each Cryptomat and then uses that in his composite, which to me is silly because you can just include that information elsewhere. it's not the right process for me, but the explanation of the Cryptomattes in Blender 3.0 is valuable to me. So have a look at that. Let's, like, all of these are basically covering things that I'm going to be quickly demoing in class, but probably in more depth. But let me give you the rundown. Okay, I need to go share my screen again. That's impressive, Franco. 5 phone numbers. I remember my own. Remembering 5 phone numbers. What, did you only get like a mobile, like a smart? It's okay. It's impressive because it's non-essential anymore, not because it's impressive to memorize that amount of numbers. I'm sure if you really pushed yourself, you would be able to do at least 20. But anyway, but why would you? I have to be like, it'll start being like non-essential numbers, like people that you just call every now and then. In off case. Okay, back to the point. I was sharing my screen. Okay, so can you guys see my screen, Blender? Cool. Okay. I was looking for an example scene, but I realized that I've cleared out most of my projects from my laptop to make space. We can look for something. I just see a bunch of see if that's anything. This is okay. It is it's a thing. It's a little scene. Okay. I suspect that's probably a light of sorts. And what does it render like? I don't know what is causing this light, to be honest. Definitely not that other reflector. Okay, so sorry, not the best example scene, but literally just here to allow us to set up some render settings. You probably want to make a little bit of sense out of your collections and your project as well. Okay, the main takeaway here is that we need to establish what kind of passes we need. So the way to go and set up your file, first of all, and this you'll find in the majority of those videos, which is actually the one that I wanted to start, well, not the one that I wanted to start with, but the one particularly on EXRs, explains a lot about the color gamut of the EXR, the richness of the format, use cases, and so on. And it really is the best format for rendering and compositing. Even if you aren't using any of the multi-layer stuff, it's still better to render OpenEXR, and you can still compress it. So I actually like the Pixar compression for this. And I think this quality render, let me just set up some render frames here as well. Do I have a camera? I have a camera. Okay, 25 frames. Let's just move the camera for interest's sake. Okay, so we have a little bit of camera movement there. But nothing in the background. That should still render as alphas. So let's just see what do we have here. I saw in another tutorial that they use the mist pass instead of the Z buffer because the Z buffer doesn't necessarily have anti-aliasing on it, but it's worth testing. So because we have alpha in our scene, if you have, then you need RGBA. Otherwise, RGB should be fine. That's if you're replacing the background. Then I did mention compression over here. Most of these are pretty good. Those lossless ones will obviously make massive files, so it's good to have a bit of compression, and a lot of these compressions aren't really noticeable to the naked eye, and you still have your entire linear color gamut to go and choose from. So this one, why I like it is just because it's Pixar proprietary compression, and I think those might even be Industrial Lights and Magic's proprietary compression, because they used to, I think they started the whole EXR format movement. Okay, but that's the one that I use. And then the passes that you want to include there, if you just render out this, so that should render fast enough on here. If I just tell it where to render to, just go back to project blends. Probably call it something, right? Okay, so already this is a problem because we can't wait that long just to render every single frame. We need to export these frames really quick so we can get them to be the right size, the right format, have the right passes, and do a pre-comp. So it's really not about waiting for render quality at this stage. Can't afford 25 seconds a frame. We want to push these out really fast. It might just be that my system is really slow or for whatever reason, but that's not acceptable. So we're going to just quit that and let's see what we can do to sort this out. Okay, first of all, it's 30%. None like that. We want the resolution to be proper. You can set it to HDTV 1080p preset if you want to. And then this is important to get right though. I think you can just switch it and your playback will just be the right frame range without it moving your frames. So that's not too much of an issue. But if you start rendering it out into 4 frames and then start comping it in 5 frames, so you're going to drop a frame every second, it's going to make like a second or so difference to the entire animation. It will not seem like much, but if you're compositing and editing, it can cause problems down the line. Popping frames, edits that aren't back to back, or clips that aren't back to back, clips become shorter, or film falls, like holes falls through everywhere in Reddit, and throws through the background. So try and keep that standard for the entire team. Everyone working on the same frame rate is essential. Okay, frame range, so it's the range pushed up. So keep those consistent. Now let's look at ways that we can deploy this render to be a lot faster. Okay. We're not actually rendering anything from the compositor or the sequencer at this stage. We're saving out directly to file over here. That should be fine. But if you want to save out multiple files, then you obviously need to include your compositor things to do to speed it up. Use Eevee and speed it up. You could do, I think, a combination of both as well in the devices. You include GPU compute. The only difference between, and please do chip in, Chris, I think you render out of Blender when you want to. But you can use a combination. I just know that with CPU, it prefers smaller files to compute at a time. With GPU, you can increase the file size, and then that's a lot faster. So that's the only discrepancy I think you need to take note of with this switch. Obviously, if you have a robust GPU, then GPU compute would most likely be much faster. Okay, so don't worry about denoising or just rendering. These things you can switch on later on when we do lighting. Then it becomes important to see what those lights do and the quality of the renders. Now we literally just want to get those renders out. So light paths is probably what's eating up most of your resources. Okay, so obviously samples. So over here we're going to turn down those samples. Okay, however low you can go with and still see some sort of image. And that matters with the noise, maximum bounce. Over here again, there's presets. I would go for fast curve illumination, so that will turn everything down. Clamping is also useful just to make sure that those bounces don't carry on infinitely. Those are mostly light bounces, so you can clamp them to, I think like this one you could set to direct light bounces, probably something like 4, still be fine. And indirect, if I recall, I don't know, let's try something like that. And that's fine, fine. Simplify will help. So you can be 1 or 2 there. You could set the texture limit. That would also help. I don't have any textures here. Textures tend to eat a lot of your RAM, your memory, or hard drive space if it's using virtual memory. And just that process of allocating memory to the images actually takes up time in your render. So if you go back to your texture library, try and replace your images, especially if they're sort of work in progress images or working file images, PNGs or PSDs that are layered, that don't need to be, that can just be flattened, change them into JPEGs, make them nice and small, compress them if you must, or scale them to a better resolution or more appropriate resolution for that shot even. You could have multiple versions of it. You could still have your working files in full res, but then save out the actual file that you're using in the scene as a duplicate. Okay, yeah, obviously you'd need to set the resolution here as well. That's just for the viewport, so you'll have to replicate that again. That can actually even be lower. That could probably be a little bit higher. And not rendering transparency at this point. No need to bake anything. No need to really bother with the color management. This gets mentioned quite a bit. The Filmic lookup table for Blender helps level out some of the contrast in your scene. So it takes away the blackest blacks and the whitest whites and kind of just tries to tone down the white so that it doesn't overexpose, and just gives your scene an overall more professional look, I think. But yeah, then later on we need to go and set the lookup table again to use the same gamma output as Blender if you want to composite it and retain that look and feel. Right, so our very bland little scene here should be fairly optimized already. We can look at what's this? That's just a sample. Where's the tile sizes? Nope. Performance. Okay, yeah. Like I said, for CPU, you might want to make that smaller. Let's see if we can have it will be to render this now. Okay, so we're rendering it again. Slightly smaller tile size. I don't think this tile size is particularly useful for my CPU. And 32 passes still quite a while. So again, let's go back. I don't want to take that long to render. Speed it up. Let's try 256 and go back to samples and just make that 16.8. See the mess we're left with now. Just as long as we can still kind of make out what's there, I'm happy. We just need frames. Okay, that's already a lot better. Now we're looking at a couple of seconds per frame, and I'm okay with that. Okay, it's enough to work with. It's enough information so that we can do a pre-comp with. It doesn't have to be beautiful. We just want to get it out. Okay, so even this 25 frame sequence is still going to render for about 15 minutes. Is that correct? No, can't be. 8 minutes, 9 minutes. No. It doesn't give you an overall render estimate, does it? You have to calculate it yourself. Or is it like Microsoft time, where it's just an estimate and doesn't really mean anything? Okay, so we haven't actually added any passes. This is just a standard EXR. So if we go and have a look at what we're producing, okay, they aren't that small. They're actually still fairly big. The Mac Previewer previews the EXRs, which is cool, but and I think it even does it in the browser. I mean, in the file browser, but that's not true for Windows. Like, it's very difficult to see when EXR actually is of like what you rendered if you're on a Windows machine. So it's a little bit trickier. I think in that one video, the guy did mention some open source EXR viewers that could be worth checking out and getting if you don't already have one. Let me just see. They're not necessarily supposed to be that big. I think it's because I'm including the Z buffer. But 5 megs it's not an absolute train smash, but it is already getting bigger. It's probably bigger than a PNG. The difference between half float and full float is the amount of pixel depth that you get. So if you go half float, then sure, the file size will be a lot smaller, but you won't have the entire color gamut as you grade it. So it's better to have all of that. I could have rendered this out as black and white, but I'm not using that as an example. And again, we're not including any alpha, so that's not adding. I'm suspecting that that's including the Z depth, and I actually just want to see what that's doing. That's not what I'm looking for either. For this, sure, I always install plugins while I'm rendering. It's the best time to install them. And that thing goes on. Cool, but I can't remember what the shortcut is, so I might need to just refer back to that. No. This is just because I don't remember what the shortcut is. And I think the render just needs to be completed. How many more frames do we have to go? Okay, one last frame. So that's the z-depth that it's rendered out. Doesn't look very useful. Doesn't seem very useful at this point. It might just be that it's not being normalized. So then you can go and set the color range. But again, I don't even know if that's entirely useful, because that's not like I actually have also resorted to using the mist instead of the actual z-depth. But like I said, I might just be doing it wrong. You can change this the middle point of the Z, I think. That's trying to preview the entire image, but it's not. Let me see if there's something that I can get out of this. Amping or remapping or normalize. See if there is any value in there. Okay, all right. So there's something. I'm moving something else. What's that? I mean, one of these shortcuts should surely zoom the actual background image. Why am I so terrible at this? Okay, the normalize gave us some information. I think I noticed what they mean by the anti-aliasing. I wanted to zoom in there. Maybe it's just because I haven't allowed it to. Yeah, how do I do that, but in a shortcut? Okay, so I've scaled it up a bit. Hopefully I can get to where I want to be. I'm not navigating. Okay, I can't move. Move? Okay. All right, well, there you can sort of see it. So the depth buffer gives us depth, but it also, it also leaves that nasty little jagged edge. So I've used this depth buffer in the past in After Effects, and then what you get is that weird little artifact on the side of all the geometry, and it doesn't do a proper job of creating a depth pass, because this is the problem. It works, I think, in Blender fine. If you stay in Blender and you comp in here, then it might work for you. But yeah, there are other ways of achieving better results. Okay, so for multi-layers. Okay, so if we want to include depth and stuff, I just want to do a quick test here. I'm going to switch off the Z buffer because we don't need it. Okay, that saves out a preview in case you want to see what it looks like and you're struggling to view the EXRs. But like I said, those tutorials include some better workarounds for this. I just want to have a quick look at what that frame looks like. So without the Z depth in it, so I'm just going to do a quick, let's say 25 render without the depth buffer, and we can just overwrite and render that again. I actually only need one frame. Okay. Now we can have a look at what that file size is. Okay, so we saved an entire half a meg. It looks like the sort of 5 megs is like the standard for an EXR frame without alpha. With alpha, let me just make sure that it's on in film as well. So under film settings down here, just include transparency, and then render that one more time. Again, just one frame just to see. So already the depth pass is useful because, and I feel like it should almost be standard for all shots that have any depth in them. So only if it's like an absolutely flat shot, like sometimes a depth, like a top-down shot doesn't have a lot of depth in it. You're not going to have a focus shift, or there's no atmospheric fog or anything that's going to play a role in there. So top-down shots don't really make sense to have depth in them. But like anything that has that's looking out into the distance, because a lot of things happen with depths. If you look at any photograph, you'll see that your saturation reduces over distance. You tend to get a sort of an atmospheric haze. So there's this sort of introduction of a bluish, well, at least for exterior shots, you get this sort of bluish tint to things. There's, like I said, less contrast. There's haze. There's just regular depth of field as well. A lot of things that can help you separate your foreground information from your background information. So it's worthwhile having a depth pass. This then would essentially be your color pass, the base one with all the lighting included. If you have weird things like flashing lights or a light that appears at some point in your shot and doesn't at any other stage, you may want to separate direct and indirect lighting, which you can do. Just look at all the options that you have available to you. The quick and dirty way of doing this is just switching all of it on and let your hard drive carry the load. But it's not ideal. So what you want to do is look at your shot and try and figure out what you need from the frames. Okay, we can start here at the top. So we're still including depth, even though we haven't switched it on in that pass. Still on in here. Huh. Okay. Okay. One more time. Okay, switching off that depth made absolutely no change to the output, so that's fine. If we're using mist for depth, then we'll have a mist pass. If you want to do any post lighting or post texturing or something like that, I'll show you an add-on that uses your normals from your scene to add 2D lights, but not now. Motion vectors are useful for motion blur. There's also a way that I sort of jippo this in post, because motion blur pretty much just blurs things, so it, wherever there's movement, and you can do that in post. It's obviously not exact, but it works. So there's an add-on that does the blurring without motion vectors. But if you have like a really, I don't know, working with motion vectors, let's keep it on ice for now, see where we need motion blur specific motion blur for something, then you can add that. You can separate the denoise data. This I used in the past, object indexes and material indexes for what was sort of like a Cryptomatte, because I didn't have Cryptomattes at that point. But for now, you can just use Cryptomattes instead. Lighting, if you want to separate any of this, sometimes it makes sense to separate ambient occlusion and shadows, or emission. If you want to glow it in post, then that's also useful to have. If you do have volume in your scenes, or if we're rendering any effects and stuff like that, you might want to separate some of these other passes. If you have a shadow catcher, of course. For now, I'm going to keep it standard to ambient occlusion. And then on Cryptomattes, Cryptomatte can be very useful. It basically creates a mask for things that you want to perhaps treat or separate, or perhaps like if I just went to like the first shot on those reviews. Sorry, now I've closed all my reviews. Go here. Open again. Okay. In this shot, for instance, if we, or even later, maybe a shot that I looked at, as he pulls away, I realize this is not a film that anyone else is currently working on in this group necessarily. Okay, so this was just a little comment on what we need to add to the shot to make the impression of the car speeding away feel more realistic and tangible, like it's actually happening, right? So we'll see perhaps a little bit of camera shake, a little bit of dust kicking off from the dust and particles and things like that kicking off from the tires. And to separate things like that, like if we're adding like little particle effects and things at the back here behind these tires, we need to separate this from the background. Sometimes we want to separate foreground from middle ground from background. So background is useful to separate because then you can add additional depths to that, but your depth pass kind of does that for you. And yeah, foreground kind of again covered by your depths, but you would need to have a matte that separates this object from the rest of the objects. The Cryptomatte on here does has a couple of options. Like objects will literally separate every single object into a different color, and sometimes it would need to save multiple Cryptomatte passes, and then you have to go and look for the Cryptomatte that you actually want. Materials would do the same for materials, and the one that I find the most useful is the assets one, because that looks at the hierarchy, and if anything is part of a specific hierarchy, it'll separate that as an element. So typically your characters with their eyes and their mouth and their hair and their clothes and all that sort of stuff should be part of one hierarchy, which it is. It's part of an armature at least. But that should have a parent, and then that is collected as one Cryptomatte. But you can also use this process of parenting things to larger structures to make sure that your Cryptomatte actually turns out the way that you want it to. So there's a way, again, covered in one of those tutorials, where you can quickly just preview all your Cryptomattes that you've rendered out. But what you want to do is add elements that you know that you want separate within their own hierarchy, even if you just parent that entire thing to a null that doesn't really do anything, just so that the Cryptomatte reads that as a single entity. Then you have a lot more to work with. The Cryptomattes make a lot more sense. Okay. If you're switching on, okay, so there we can see how many levels of assets and things we want. We can test this. So let's do a quick foreground, background distinction in the scene, or separation rather. See that door. Actually, I'm just going to switch this off quick and grab everything except for the table and the floor, if I can select those. Okay, so all of that I want as part of one thing, not the camera either, not the light, but in terms of Cryptomatte, I would like that. Actually, also separate the door. Sorry about that. And that, a quick way to just organize this is obviously just to move it to a new collection. So M, new collection, let's do background there, and then I can go and create a empty or you could also call this something like static or whatever. Makes sense. And you should, since that doesn't have any information or additional scaling information or positional information, well, it shouldn't have. I think I moved it in there a little too hastily. You just need to make sure that the item itself is in the global 0. If you don't want it to affect anything else, so that's fine. Then we can just parent them all to that. Naturally, you don't want to break any of the animation by parenting stuff to other things. So just, be clever and double check whether everything's still intact. So technically that should produce one Cryptomatte. The floor will be one. The table, I like that. Table is called floor. Table will be one. And door. There's door number 2. There's door number 2. Door frame. Okay, so now if we render out a Cryptomatte, that should be good. Let's see, assets, that many levels. And we need to go back to our rendering settings because now we have different passes that we want to include in the same pass. I am just again going to go to frame 1. Instead of EXR, I'm going to go multi-layer EXR. Pretty much everything else is the same. We can overwrite, that's fine. And we've only selected a few passes to include here. I think probably like the essential. So we haven't set up the mist yet. That's something that we still need to do. But we've got our color, we've got our depths, we've got ambient occlusion. If we want to add it back, it's nice to have it as a separate, because you can also color it, and then that's your shadow color. And we have a Cryptomatte for all our assets. So I think those are like the key ones that you want. And then we can go ahead and render this again. I think I could probably speed this up even more if I chose GPU and bigger tiles, but hey. Okay. And I'm just curious, so I just want to see what the frame size difference. Okay, dokie. So the regular EXRs can be previewed, multi-layer EXRs not. So now I'm stuck in the same boat as the rest of you. Okay, so let's have a quick look at some of the references. There's one or two things that I just want to point out, so you know where to find them as well. And then I'd actually like to continue with the reviews. The multi-layer EXR is part of your submission, so make sure that those are properly set up. Where you can go wrong now is when you actually submit an EXR with a Cryptomatte that makes no sense whatsoever, or a mist pass that's not actually providing you with any depth information, or ambient occlusion that doesn't actually work. So make sure that these passes are actually functional when you submit them. And the rest of the compositing process you can either do in Blender or in Fusion or in After Effects. I've included again aspects of tutorials that cover portions of those enough so that you can comp in it, but you'll choose the one that you're most proficient at. I wonder why that's coming out black and that's transparent. That's a bit strange, but okay. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly switch my screen again. Yes, you do have to set the max depth of the mist pass. It's also explained in one of those tutorials, so I think let's go there. Nice. Yes, this is true. What is this? Oh, yes. Okay, so if you need other passes, obviously multi-layer. If you just need a color pass, it still makes sense to render. Let me just show you that. Okay, I'm gonna just change this to a tab. Sure, we can stay on YouTube. So we should just be able to grab them from here.
Point out. We're also going to look at an easy way. Premiere, Fusion, really any program. The first thing you want to do is go over to your view layer properties.
So one bit that I really want to point out is the way that he's viewing the CryptoMats. So again, I said that he sets up, so we've gone through pretty much the same process, but he sets up an output node to produce PNG sequence for all the separates. But what's useful here is that his multi-layer EXR now has all the CryptoMats, and then you can go and there's this CryptoMat node that allows you to go and pick the material ID straight from the renderer so that you can go and test whether those CryptoMats actually work. Okay, so that's what's useful from this portion. The other one makes a pretty good case for EXRs in general. So I think that's worth just seeing the introduction.
55% said PNG, but only 5% says they're exporting in EXR. And I just want to show you the problem with that.
Sorry, just trying to make sense of this player.
Okay, so here we are in Blender, and we're looking at the pre-rendered shot. So here you can see the default settings in Blender. When you are making a new project file, the file format is by default set to PNG. So the problem with this that I'm going to show you is that this fire is really bright. But if we lower the exposure here, you can see we're lowering the entire image. But what I also did is I also exported this in EXR. Now we're going to see what the difference is between a really bright PNG render with the exposure lowered and a really bright EXR render when the exposure is low. Look at that. We have all the information. The fire is not overexposed, because if you're rendering in the EXR format, it's impossible to overexpose your footage. Just think about that. You are running around in Blender with a camera that's impossible to overexpose. But if you're rendering it as a PNG sequence, you're clipping this data. You're losing all this data. So in this tutorial, we are going to export a video file from Blender in the EXR format, and then we're going to import it in DaVinci Resolve without losing any of this data, and we're going to keep the Filmic view transform.
Right, so that particular one is useful for going and putting back your lookup table to be filmic, and it's quite a process. Like, you have to go and add code to the Blender filmic lookup table so that it can be read in Fusion, but it's possible. Yes, render EXR. And what else? Let's just go back. Then the depth pass in After Effects. There's also a workflow for doing the filmic effect in After Effects, so getting back your lookup tables and stuff like that. You can obviously also use a different LUT, but then your footage will look differently. It'll be graded differently, which is fine if the Blender default is not what you're going for. But if you were trying to match that, there's a way of getting the filmic lookup table to work in both Fusion and in After Effects. Those are the tutorials that I linked there, so you can go and check those out. This is the one on the
same thing. You just stop. Keep the images as raw as possible.
This is the one on the depth, and that uses mist. I think it's worth just quickly looking at this because I already forgot how to switch on the mist. So it's always good to go and reference those again. Wait, let me try it first. It's just good to give it a shot. Hey, so it's on the rendering, but it also needs to be on in the scene, I think. Yeah, so that is fine. And then on the camera, I think. Mist. Okay, so then that essentially sets the mist for the, or visualizes the mist for the scene. So I suppose going back to the scene and then starting it at 0 because that's where our camera starts, and then having the fall off, just make sure that it includes everything. And then I'm going to set it to linear because I know what to expect when I give it a linear input. Then I don't have these this sort of gradient curve all of a sudden. Just make that 50. Okay, so now my depth or my mist should actually be set up as well. Ha! Not sharing my screen, am I? Thank you for pinging me. I'm going to switch in a minute. I have not worked with the ASYS lookup table, but I have heard of it. EXR files can be big, but they don't need to be big. You don't have to include all the data, just the essential data. Okay, here we go again. Sorry, popping up the screen. Right, so all I did was I went to scene properties to change the actual mist pass over here. It was switched on in the render settings, and then on the camera, lastly, you can tell it to pre-visualize the mist area. So if you just say show mist, it draws this line, and then that should just include your entire scene. Then it'll be fine. Okay, I'm going to render this one more time with all of those settings now in place, and then I'll show you the comp example in After Effects. And then we can go back to the reviews. Sorry, this is taking so long. Let me try one more time. Render settings. Let's go to GPU. Yes. Do it. Here's my tiling. Volumes, tiling. 2 tiles and render. Go GPU, go. Damn, that's not. Is it faster? It's like a second faster. Not fast enough. Let's go faster. Total number of bounces. Let's just make it 4. Transmission 4. Clamp everything 4. Fine. And samples. Just 2 samples. Let's render. Yeah, fine. 2 seconds a frame. That's exactly what I'm after. I can still see stuff. It ain't pretty, but it's there. So the idea here is that you should technically be able to, at this pace at least, render your entire project, comp your entire project, and then set up proper renders just to replace the ones that are already in the comp, and then your film is done. Okay, so just very quickly, then we can take a bit of a break and we'll come back and do all the reviews. We can also split into teams once we do the reviews, so you guys can catch up with the rest of your team. We'll do that on Discord, so hopefully I won't keep you busy for much longer, and then we can reconvene on Discord. Okay, so in After Effects, I'll just go and import some files, all those files. Sorry, blends, renders, and just import that OpenEXR sequence. That's perfect. You can drag it into a comp over here. Now I have a composition. Won't see anything because it doesn't know how to interpret the information yet. So we'll have to add an effect called extractor to our footage. So it's in the 3D channels extractor. Then under the extractor, we need to tell it what to extract. So over here we have our combined, then we have our cryptomats, ambient occlusion, and our mist. So those are the things that we've set up. It seems like it's still created quite a few cryptomat assets over there, which I'm a little like disappointed that it created 4 or 3 layers for the amount of things that I had set up. So I'm not sure why that is yet. Sorry, that's not the ambient occlusion I wanted. I'm just going to use the combined layer. So you can see it's pretty rough. That's obviously also now trying to display it as fast as possible. It's not as bad as I thought it was. It's actually just the resolution that's not showing up. Okay, so that's what we got. For the other passes, you'll just have to use the extractor over and over again and just get the right things out. I can't really say whether this, let's do a couple of things here, just switch that on. Okay, so that transparency is still there. I think there's a glass panel in there and that's what's doing this. So that's probably the mistake there. And okay, so we still have alpha. It's not using a lookup table, but because of the example that I'm using, I can't really tell what the gamma is doing. So that's just me being bad. I should be able to add a lookup table to that and get a better grade. But for now, this should be fine. Color is not really what we're looking at. We're literally just looking at the passes. So in this one, I'm going to change it to AO, and obviously AO gets multiplied on top of that. So that can be multiplied. And this is normally where you want to kind of just make sure how much of this you actually want to use. So with AO, I normally go and add a tint. So you'll have stylize. Is it stylize or is it just color correction? Tint. And then you'll do a slightly bluish, maybe not necessarily, but just slightly bluish tint. That's showing up a little weird at the moment, but you can see it does help. This. Let's see what our mist looks like. So just take the bottom one, duplicate that. Mist. Okay, so we've got mist, which is cool. You can go, I think, and tweak these values so that you get the focus to be at the right distance, I think, but there's again a better way of doing that. The mist itself needs to be, I think it needs to be pre-comped so that it can get this information as a flat image instead of still getting it from the extractor. But essentially you'll go to your 3D channels and look for, I think it's camera depth of field. I might be putting it on the wrong place. I'm just going to hide that for a second, grab this one, see if I can add that depth of field. No, that's not it. That's camera depth. It's the wrong effect. Let me just see. Where is it? Channels. It's somewhere else. There's a tracker. That's not it. Sorry, I lost it. It's in here somewhere. I guess I can search it under the effects panel here. Camera. Yes. depth. Hello. What is this doing? It's so cramped in here. Camera lens blur, that's the one you want. Okay. Then the camera lens blur can pick a source for your depth of field. And in the tutorial, the guy says that you have to invert it before you export it. So I've just exported it straight with the EXR because you can always go and invert it over here. And you can see that it's doing something. Like there is depth of field. It's obviously focusing somewhere else. You can set this add-on in itself, this built-in lens camera lens blur is not the best. It's especially bad at doing alpha. So it works for flat renders with depth included, then it's cool. You can use the luminance. You can set the blurring distance or the focal distance over here. These values will just be inverted because remember you've now inverted the image itself. So the further you or the higher you go, the closer the field of view would be. But it is a pretty dodgy add-on. There's a better one, but a paid one for After Effects called don't have any of them here. Frisch Luft or something like that. It has depth of field put into it. Some weird Luft. I don't know what I'm. Yeah, Frisch Luft. This one. But it's a little bit expensive. It works really well though. I don't have it installed currently, but it's good to have them, and it's a little faster. I think I only use this one of theirs, but then I also use a bunch of other add-ons for the motion blur. So there's this one, obviously Red Giant, Trap Code, that sort of stuff you can also have access to. But there's also one called Real Smart Revision. So Revision does an add-on called Real Smart Motion Blur, and that you can add as an adjustment layer. And then that does motion blur for you on top. You can set that up so that it's, you'll see it in some of the movement. If you put down the sensitivity and increase the blur amount, you should start seeing what it's doing in terms of motion blur. So this calculates the pixel difference. I don't know if that's depth of field or motion blur, but yeah, that's what I use for motion blur. What else do we have? Let's just have a quick look at the Cryptomats and then we're done. And we'll take a break until 12. Okay, same process though. I'm just going to duplicate the color under the effects, not the lens blur at the moment. And we'll just pick the Cryptomat one. And I'm just going to hide all the other layers so I can see what's going on there. That didn't produce anything, neither did that or that. So the Cryptomats didn't work. Might be a little hasty in saying that that didn't work, but I really don't see anything. Does not seem like they exported properly. Okay. Okay, so while I have a look at what I did wrong to get the Cryptomats to fail, I reckon we can take a bit of a break and then meet back here at 12. Cool.